Everything I'm going to say in this video is an opinion spoken with a lot of humility. I cannot express enough how much I admire and respect the man that is Brandon Sanderson. He has done so much for us fantasy readers. Look at how many people have started reading fantasy specifically because of him. He's done so much for smaller authors like myself, and he is just overall such a great guy. Like, it's hard to dislike him as a person. So I want to make that very abundantly clear. My journey with Sanderson's book started the same as many others with Mistborn, and this was at a time when I wasn't reading much fantasy. I was into other genres of reading, and Mistborn was a thing that really brought me back into what was my childhood favorite genre, so I'm forever grateful to him. After reading Mistborn Era 1, I went on a binge and binged his entire bibliography. I read Mistborn Era 2, I read Elantris, Warbreaker, I read all of the short stories, I read Emperor's Soul, I read all of Stormlight Archive. And this was around the time when Rhythm of War was coming out. So after I finished all of my big Sanderson binge, I kind of found myself feeling a bit burnt out with Sanderson. I kept thinking to myself, something is missing. Even though I love this guy's stories, I love the world building that he's doing, I didn't quite have an understanding of what was wrong. So then I broadened my horizons. I'd run out of Sanderson anyway, so I was going to go and read other authors. I read Abercrombie, I read Hobb, I read Bernard Cornwell, I read James Clavell. I read a lot of other authors over the past few years, like Guy Gabriel, GGK, for instance. And the more and more I read, the less appealing Sanderson's books seemed to me. Every time he announced a new book, I kind of had this feeling of like, I want to read it, but I kind of don't. And as I read more, as I wrote my own books, I came to a better understanding of what works for me in reading. And I think this is a journey which every reader goes on and every reader should go on. So over time, that's what was happening. I was getting a better understanding of who I am as a reader. And then Wind and Truth was announced. So there was obviously a bit of hype there. But at the same time, I felt a sense of anxiety because I was like, man, I want to return to Roshar. I want to know what happens next in the Stormlight Archive. But I don't know if I want to read another Brandon Sanderson book. And so there was this sort of anxiety over this entire long process where he was announcing his regular updates and how much of the book has been completed. And every time one of those updates came out, I became more anxious because I kept thinking to myself, this is happening too fast. You're going way too fast. No book this long should be written this fast because you will sacrifice quality. That was my feeling as someone who took a while to write his books, who really slaved over every word. So this was like an author's perspective. And I'm not saying I'm a good author or anything. And Brandon Sanderson is obviously very prolific. But I think when you go really fast, you're always going to sacrifice quality, especially for a book this long. So this was my general anxiety leading up to the release of Wind and Truth. The book finally came out, and that's when I started watching recap videos for the rest of the series. I wasn't going to go back and reread them, but like those recap videos really hyped me up, and I was like, man, Roshar is so cool. Stormlight Archive is an awesome plot, and like these great characters, and wow, there's amazing moments. And ultimately, like, I felt that hype going into Wind and Truth. I was ready for it. And then I started reading it, and within the first 5%, my hype meter just started plummeting. I found myself struggling through the first 70-ish% of this book. And I think a large part of that is because my own tastes have changed, so I don't know how much of this is specific to Wind and Truth. I don't know if I went back and reread the rest of Stormlight, if my feelings would be different. But regardless, reading Wind and Truth, I just felt like it was so hard for me to get immersed. And then towards the last 30%, when the plot started to pick up, all of the little things which were bothering me and keeping me from immersion, I was able to ignore them a little bit better. I was able to get used to his writing style. And so for the last 30% of the book, I really did enjoy. As for why Wind and Truth didn't work for me, it really isn't about the story. I think for the most part, he did a really good job resolving these very intricate plot lines. There were a lot of really awesome things, some great twists, some, like very unexpected things that happened in this book. A lot of content was covered. So in that sense, I liked it a lot. I liked the way a lot of character arcs resolved. I do have a few small issues with some characters and some plot lines, and we can get into that. But the main reason I didn't, Wind and Truth didn't work for me, it really is about craft and style and prose. And so it's more about the details of the writing. And this is one of those things where I know a lot of people don't care about these things, or at least they, feel that it's not that important. But I wanted to take a moment to sort of give you a different perspective on why, for a reader like me, it can be important. Like a lot of the time for me, immersion is dependent on craft, because if the prose is not good, then I don't feel like the world is real. If the dialogue is not vivid, then the characters are not real. And if the world and the characters are not real, I don't care what happens to them. So this is kind of the experience I was finding as I went through Wind and Truth. Was like I just cared less and less about these characters because they felt like robots to me. So I wanted to go into the details of that. I wanted to look at a few certain passages, just cherry picking some random passages. But this really was a book long problem that I struggled with, where his writing just kept pulling me out of the story. And that's, something that Sanderson himself has said that he doesn't want that to happen. So if you're patient with me, I put together this very clunky presentation. It's very, very bootleg and bad, but I think it'll give us an opportunity to sort of look at certain things from Sanderson's writing that were pulling me out of the story, and hopefully that can give you a new perspective, something else to think about. So let's go look at that now. All right, so this is the really bootleg PowerPoint presentation I put together for my little Wind and Truth critique. Please forgive my horrible formatting. I spent like 10 minutes on this, so give me a break. What I'm going to go over is essentially, I have all of my issues ranked here in order of magnitude. So for me, the biggest issue with this book was the complete lack of subtext. And then after that, it was clunky prose. So I'm going to go into a few examples. And then part of prose is the dialogue, which either felt stilted and robotic or juvenile. And then some perspective control things, which I think Sanderson could have done a little bit better on. And there were just a lot of modernisms, like just modern words used in Roshar, which brought me out of the story. After that, I think at a much, much lower order of magnitude, a few things with forced inclusivity, like diversity in the book is cool, but at some points it felt a little bit forced, so I wanted to share some of my thoughts on that. And then this concept, which I termed the loss of mystery, so we'll go into that, and then a few particular plot and character thoughts I had, and finally the audio narration, because I did do this in audio. Okay, so lack of subtext / overdone introspection. And this, like I said, this was by far my biggest issue, but I also feel like I don't need to spend that much time talking about it, because from what I've been seeing, a lot of people had similar complaints about Wind and Truth, wherein, the book starts with the line, Kaladin felt good. So, first of all, like, that's not going to win any awards for the best first line in the book, right? Like, I know this is a chapter 1 first line, not the prologue first line, but regardless, what this does is it really sets the right tone for this book, which is that Sanderson will always tell you how every single character is feeling at every single point, why they're feeling that way, how they came about to feeling that way, and how that might change in the future. Like, he is just constantly hammering it home. There is never any moment of doubt. Have you, like, when you were reading this book, did you ever stop and think, I wonder how Shallan's feeling right now. Oh, look at all these things she's going through. I wonder how. No, there's no doubt, because he's going to take his time and tell you exactly the character's feelings. And like, that's what you get. Like, Shallan is introduced in a very similar way, introspecting about what she went through in Rhythm of War and what she's been on now. And then Kaladin, again, a lot of introspection. So the specific passages I have here are from the beginning of the book. And I think, like, it's okay. It's not the most compelling way to start a book, but it's okay. It's not a big deal if you, like, spend some time. You have these characters being very introspective, thinking about what they've been through, and you can start the story from there. You remind the readers of, the story so far, and where, like, from there you can go on. But then at some point you have to be able to edit that out, right? And you have to be able to say, okay, now it's going to be a bit of a mystery. Like, I'm going to trust the readers to kind of figure out, like, okay, Kaladin, what, like, this is the 5th book after, like, 2 million words or something. Like, we should have a pretty good idea of who Kaladin and Shallan are by now, right? So you have to trust the readers to figure out how they're feeling at some points, instead of just continuously, repetitively telling us over and over again. And one of the interesting things is a perspective as an author where I go into this is, when you're writing a new book, at least for me, I found that it was very easy in the first draft, or the easiest way to do subtext and show, don't tell and stuff like that was in the first draft. Like, you just be outright with it, right? Like, you just write down stuff like Kaladin felt good. You just write down how your characters are feeling, because that helps you process it yourself, right? So I feel like Sanderson might have a similar process where, like, putting in this introspection is a part of him understanding how his characters are feeling. But then you have to go back in your editing and kind of think about where you're overdoing it, right? Like introspection is not bad. I have to make that clear. Introspection is necessary for a good story, but it can be very easy to overdo it. You know, this is a show don't tell mentality where a lot of people, like obviously, you know, we've been given the advice that you have to show don't tell, but now there seems to be this counter advice, which is that, oh, actually you should be telling more, you know, like everyone, like there's a lot of conflict about this, but really it's about striking the balance. And I think Sanderson over time has more and more gone towards the telling, not showing side. And to me, it's like, you don't trust your readers to understand this. And the problem is we end up not feeling like these characters are real because you know, like in reality, people are more complicated than that, right? Like if you're always telling me how a character feels, then he will always be exactly what you told me. But if you showed me what he's doing, then I can kind of have a more three-dimensional picture of that character. You know, like most people are not even close to as introspective as these Stormlight characters are. Like we don't sit there fully understanding exactly how we feel all the time about every single thing, right? Like we're just doing things, and that's much more realistic, I think. And then afterwards you can kind of reflect, like, why did I do that? Why did I feel, you know, what was I feeling in that moment? I think that's a lot more realistic. And so basically, like without subtext, he's not giving us anything to think about when it comes to these characters. You know, like here's one short example. So this is not so much introspection, but you know, a place where I thought there was an opportunity for a bit more subtext, which he didn't have. So specifically, I'm talking about this line here. You know, Kaladin is meeting with his Bridge 4 crew, and he's just thinking about all that they've been through. Okay, great. And then he comes to this. You know, he's feeling the lack of others. Teft, Maps, Dunny, Rock, not Moash. He no longer missed Moash. Kaladin's hatred had eased. He'd accepted there would always be those he couldn't protect, but he had not given up his right to take Moash to task. Kaladin would see that Teft got a chance to spit on Moash in the afterlife, if such a thing actually existed. So, why do we need all that? Right? Like, isn't it so much more interesting if you just took that out? Like, if you just took out this passage here. What if you just left it at, not Moash? He no longer missed Moash. Isn't that more interesting? Because then we're thinking, oh, what's Kaladin going to do when he meets Moash? Right? Like, this has always been, like, part of the conflict that Kaladin has had with Moash. It's like, he can't quite fight him, right? Like, this was part of the big conflict in the last book. And so, if you just leave that there, there's a lot more subtext. There's a lot more mystery. It makes Kaladin more interesting. It makes his relationship with Moash more interesting. You know, like, we don't need this long explanation for how exactly he's feeling. He'd accepted there would always be those. Like, come on, Kaladin, like, chill. You don't need to be so introspective, right? And not only that, but it kind of kills the flow of the scene, right? Because we're in this moment where he's bonding with his bridge crew, and no, we're gonna take you out of that for a second and talk about Moash for a second, right? So I think with subtext, if like one great example of just spectacular subtext is Robin Hobb. If you've read any of Robin Hobb's books, then you will see that they're so rich with subtext. Like, there's so many layers behind the words, and you know, like, it's one of those things where so many people are conflicted about the main point of view character Fitz, because like it's very hard to understand him, right? Like, he is an introspective guy, but like everyone has a different interpretation. Like, why did Fitz do that? Like, what was he thinking? And that's what makes him so real and so human, because Robin Hobb has this deep understanding of people. And you know, like, she has that that subtext, not only in the main character, but in every relationship, in the way the dialogue, right? Like, every piece of dialogue between two characters has multiple meanings. Like, there's rich history there, and it just brings everything to life. You know, you can write essays on Robin Hobb's books, and then you can do a character analysis for Fitz or whatever other character, and two different people can have completely different perspectives, but Hobb just understands him at a deep human level. And sometimes at human level, it's like you can't even put words to it, right? Like, if it's that realistic, like when we really like someone, can you always pinpoint exactly why you like them? Like, usually not. It's like a feeling, right? So subtext is one of those things where when a book doesn't have it, it really just feels lacking, right? Like, it feels two-dimensional. So like I was saying earlier, with this book, the more I read, the more the characters just started feeling more and more robotic. And, you know, like, two-dimensional. I stopped caring that much about Kaladin, which is weird, right? Like, he used to be a favorite character for me for a long time. But over the course of this book, I was like, yeah, I get it, man. I get it. You're a therapist now. Like, okay, come on, like give me something more. And that depth of character wasn't there. I don't know if this was a Wind and Truth specific thing. I don't remember how it was in the rest of the books. I've heard that it was worse in Wind and Truth than in those. But either way, I think if a bit more time had been spent on editing, then maybe some of this could have been taken out, some of it could have been finessed, refined, and overall it would have been a lot better. Okay, so next I wanted to talk about the Sanderson's prose in particular, and I know this is a common talking point. A lot of people comment on his prose. The first thing I wanted to start off with is this idea of window pane prose. So this is something where, like many authors, I have learned a lot from Sanderson's lectures, but one of the things he talks about is that he's intentionally aiming for a prose style which he considers window pane, so it never distracts you from the story. Like, he doesn't want his prose to distract you from the story. My personal perspective on this is that it doesn't make any sense. Like, I don't think there's any such thing as window pane prose, because I think good prose never does distract from the story. Good prose is the story. Prose needs to create the atmosphere of the world and the story, and it also needs to provide the rhythm which gives the reader immersion, right? So you never want the sentences to start stumbling over each other just because you're trying to be as clear as possible, because then it pulls you out of the story, or at least it does for me. So within that context, there are differing styles, and you can have very simple prose, and I think this is what Sanderson is aiming for, and that's completely fair and completely fine. If you have simple prose, it's easy to understand. You don't need to find a thesaurus. You can have more purple prose, which is lyrical and like more poetic. And sometimes maybe some people might get distracted from the story if you spend too much time being poetic in your prose. Other people might really enjoy that and find it more immersive and feel it gives them more of an atmosphere in the book. And then something that's more archaic, and this is common in fantasy, right? Like if you read Lord of the Rings, it's written with that archaic language, and it's specific because that language creates the world, right? Like you don't need to spend so much time going over like this is the way the world is. You don't need to exposition that, because the way that everything is written itself gives you that atmosphere, right? So that's what feels immersive. Now, if you are going for a simple prose style like Sanderson is, you must still contain flow, rhythm, and atmosphere. And this is my perspective, is I think like sometimes even though he's going for that style, it's just missing flow and rhythm and, like I said, atmosphere. So, one great example of this is Piranesi. Like if you read Piranesi, it's very simple language, right? You will never need a thesaurus to understand that book, but the way it's written, it just pulls you in. Like the words just flow from one to the other, and the sense of atmosphere in that book is incredible. So it's a very short book. If you want an example of simple prose done perfectly, Piranesi is a great one. In terms of Sanderson's prose in particular, I thought that maybe one way I could go about discussing this was to just analyze one of his passages and sort of provide my perspective on like where the stumbling blocks were. So I got this one, and please don't be too intimidated by the giant wall of text. It's pretty straightforward. So this is the introduction to Seth's flashback sequences. And, I chose this particular passage because I thought that this was first of all, this is a really important introduction, right? This is like the flashbacks we're getting in this book. And B, I thought that this was one of those cases where Sanderson was intentionally trying to be a bit lyrical and trying to be a bit cute, but I just think that it was a bit under-edited, which ended up making it a bit clunky. So I wanted to go through it really fast and talk to you guys about that. So, what do we start with? Seth's son Nutoro found magic upon the wind, and so he danced with it. So right from the first sentence, that's where I get that vibe. Like he's trying to go for something lyrical and magical here, right? Like he found magic upon the wind. It's very poetic, right? But then look at the way we start this next paragraph. Strict, methodic motions at first, as per the moves he had memorized. As per the moves he had memorized. There's no rhythm to that, right? It sounds robotic. And so suddenly you've lost that sense of melody that you had from the first sentence. He stepped and spun, dancing in a wide circle around a large boulder. Zeth was as the limbs of the oak. So, we don't need the subject again. It's just adding clunkiness to this because we already know who it is that's dancing. As the limbs of the oak, rigid but ready. I mean, rigid, I don't love that word here because the rhythm's kind of odd, but it's fine. As you can see, he's going for a metaphor, right? When those shivered in the wind, why do we need this pronoun? Like again, it's like you're stumbling over itself instead of just allowing one sentence to flow into each other. Seth was as the limbs of the oak, rigid but ready, when those shivered in the wind. Do you know what I mean? Like it's kind of clunky. Seth thought he could hear their souls seeking to escape, to shed bark-like shells and emerge with new skin, pained by the cool air, yet aflush with joy. Okay, that's a nice sentence, right? There's a flourish there. It's somewhat lyrical. He's going for something pretty, painful and delightful, like all new things. So okay, first of all, you said pained there, and you're repeating painful. That's fine, but then you said joy here. So why did you go to delightful, right? Like why not just say joy again? If you want to continue that sequence, isn't it a bit nicer to just use the same words if that's what you've already established? And also, why go for the full? Like, why not just pain and delight, like all new things, right? So just adding that extra syllable kind of ruins the rhythm a bit, doesn't it, when you read it out loud? Okay, moving on. Seth's is it Zeth? Zeth's bare feet scraped across the packed earth as he danced, getting it on his toes, loving the feel of the soil. I like that. He went right to the edge, feet kissing the grass, then danced back, spinning to the accompaniment of his sister's flute. Think about the sheer quantity of syllables in this word accompaniment, right? So you can have a nice lyrical passage where the words are flowing one to another, and then you throw in a big word like accompaniment, and you start stumbling, right? You get tongue-tied. It doesn't flow as well. So, like small word choices like that can make a big difference. The music was his dance partner. Again, like that partner feels odd. Why is that there? Wind made animate through sound. Okay, that's nice. The flute was the voice of air itself. Time became thick when he danced. Molasses minutes and syrup seconds. I guess that's fine. Yet the wind wove among them, visiting each moment, lingering, then dashing away. He followed it, emulated it, became it. Okay. Now this is where I have an issue because you had a nice lyrical passage, and then more and more fluid he became as he circled the stone. Guys, tell me that's not clunky, right? Like more and more fluid. Right off the bat, I don't like that more and more. I don't like that he used became here. He became as he circled. He became it, and time became thick. So he's using the same verb 3 times in a really short sequence, which is okay, but it's not like a particularly nice verb anyway, right? So surely you could do a little bit better. More and more fluid he became as he circled the stone. No more rigidity, no more pre-planned steps. That just killed it. Like rigidity, pre-planned steps. Listen to the amount of syllables that are in that, right? Like there's no sense of flow or rhythm. I think those are horrible word choices here. Sweat flying from his brow to seek the sky. He was the air. Okay, nice. Churning, spinning, violent. So he established this pattern of using ing verbs and then breaks it with violent. And I think he's done doing that intentionally because it's like, to create a break. But at the same time, the entire thing so far with words like rigidity and pre-planned steps, like those sound so scientific and methodical that it just doesn't fit with if you're going for a lyrical vibe. So by throwing in violent, you're just adding to the mess, right? Around and around, his dance worship for the rock in the center of the bare ground. 5 feet across and 3 feet high. At least the part that emerged from the soil. Guys, what the hell is this? Why do you need at least the part that emerged from the soil? Where did that come from? Why does it matter? Why is that there? It's killing this paragraph. It's destruction. It's paragraph destruction. Like 5 feet across, 3 feet high. We don't even need that. But at least the part that emerged from the soil? What? That's so dumb. Like, okay, I can't even put into words how much of a break that is for me. Like if I'm reading this, I'm getting into a story, and then at least the part that emerged from the soil, like I it breaks me out of the story, right? It kills the flow of the paragraph. It kills the flow of the scene. Why is that there? It was the largest in the region. We don't even need that, to be honest, but maybe it's important for some reason, so okay, fine. When he was wind, he felt he could touch that sacred stone, which had never known the hands of man. I like that. He imagined how it would feel, the stone of his family, the stone of his past, the stone to whom he gave his dance. He stopped, finally, panting. His sister's music cut off, leaving his only applause the bleating of the sheep. Okay, so I think we can stop there. Overall, the passages are clear and they get the idea across. I just feel like if a bit more time had been spent in editing, you could make it flow a little bit better. You could add a sense of rhythm. If you're going for something lyrical, I feel like you could just make it a little bit better. And I want to say this with complete humility, guys. I am not a better author than Brandon Sanderson. I will never ever make that claim. Nor I'm not even a good author. I'm not an editor. But I wanted to like try to make this point where I think if a line edit had been if this passage had been like fully line edited, it could have been a little bit better. So I did try to rewrite it myself just to see how I would have written it, and my style I think might be different, right? Like you might not appreciate the way that I wrote it, and you might prefer the way Sanderson wrote it, and that's totally fine. But I hope you get the idea that like we could still make small improvements here, and you know, like this particular passage is just symbolic of the entire book, right? Like this is just one little part I found, but these are the kind of clunky prose decisions which just continuously took me out of the story. So I'm gonna go over my rewrite, and again, guys, I do this with full humility. Like, who am I to rewrite Brandon Sanderson's books? Like, no, please. This is just my own interpretation, like a different way to write it, which for me, I think I personally prefer, but you know, you may not. So please accept it with all humility. Okay. Seth, son Nuturo, found magic upon the wind, and he danced with it. Strict, methodic, stepping and spinning, twirling in a circle around a large boulder. He was the limbs of an oak, rigid but ready, a soul seeking escape, to shed bark like a shell and emerge with new skin, pained by cool air, a flush with joy. Pain and joy, like all new things. His bare feet scraped packed earth, the feel of soil on his toes, kissing the grass, spinning to the song of his sister's flute. Music, the voice of the wind, his consort. Time moved like molasses, yet the wind visited each moment, lingering, then dashing away. He followed it, became it. His steps shed their stiffness, circling the stone, sweat flying from his brow to seek the sky. He was air, churning, spinning, surging, around and around, his dance of worship for the rock. Sacred stone, one that had never known the hands of man. In that moment, he felt he could touch it, the stone of his family, the stone of his past, the stone to whom he gave his dance. He stopped, panting, his sister's music cut off, leaving his only applause the bleating of sheep. I don't know if it's better than Sanderson's, but I think I like the sense of rhythm a little bit better. Like I tried to put a bit more flow into it. I tried to think about how, you know, like everything was flowing together and how it would sound being read aloud. And ultimately, like, the point of this exercise is not to say, again, that my version is better, but it's just to say that I think Sanderson's version could have been better, right? Like if there was just a bit more line editing, if there was just a bit more thought about the readability, about the way it sounded and felt reading it, his passage, then it might have turned out better. And the other thing is like this, my rewrite is, so the original word count was 318 words, and my rewrite is 201, right? So just by tightening up the prose a little bit, like you save about a third of the words. And that's one of the things with this book is that it's extremely indulgent, right? To write a 1,400 page book, like let's be very clear. Not every scene that was in this book needed to be in this book. We didn't need to see Lift looking at Windrunner's butts. Like we don't need that at all. It doesn't add much to the story. It's very indulgent to put those things in, and Sanderson again can get away with that because he's a very popular, well-known author. But that's not to say that it wouldn't be better if you remove those scenes. However, the one thing that I'm certain about is that if his prose was just tightened up a little bit, right? If you just tighten up the prose, you could definitely save like 200 pages in word count just by doing that. But that's just not something which they took the time to do, I suppose. And I don't know, I think that's unfortunate, right? Because I think the story would be better for it. Okay, so dialogue is another part of prose, and I think this was another facet of Wind and Truth which really drew me out. Is a lot of the time the characters' dialogues felt very robotic and stilted, right? Like it felt like they're using words which just feel out of place in organic, natural dialogue, and that because of that, they kind of felt like robots a lot of the time. So just one example of this passage here is a dialogue between Syl and Kaladin. So listen to this piece of Kaladin's speech. Yeah, they're my friends. I want them to be happy. But there's more. I try to imagine myself with Shallan, and I can't help thinking our individual neuroses would feed off one another in dangerous ways. My sadness fueling her feelings of abandonment when I retreat. Her self-destruction triggering my panic at being unable to help. And this was like especially prominent with Kaladin. I don't understand why, like, does anyone ever talk like this? My individual neuroses would feed off one another in dangerous ways. Like, am I the only one who finds that very robotic? And it's as if you had ChatGPT audio on or something. I don't like it. I don't like it at all. And over the course of the book, dialogue like this just made me dislike the characters more and more. Like, not so dislike, but just made them feel less and less real. And obviously, when that happens, like combined with that subtext argument I was saying earlier, I just don't care. Like, what happens to Kaladin at the end? I don't know. He's a robot. Look at the way he talks. Like, I don't care, right? And then this structure that Sanderson uses very often, my sadness fueling her feelings of abandonment. He uses ing verbs a lot in dialogue, which is okay, but like the way he uses them never feels natural. It doesn't. Yeah. Here's another example, right? This is Drehi talking to Renarin. You can do this, Drehi said. If you don't want to, that's all right. But Renarin, I know you walked onto a battlefield at Valen Field, determined to make a stand against overwhelming odds all by yourself. I know you struggled with visions of the future and sorted through them, bringing messages to your father. So again, like, I know you walked onto a battlefield determined to make a stand against overwhelming odds. His word choices like that, like, why is overwhelming the word he uses? That's not really something that usually shows up in natural dialogue, especially for a character like Drehi. It doesn't really make sense to me. And then, like, again, we have that same bringing messages to your father. Like, that use of the ing verb and this sentence structure here, which Sanderson uses so often. This is kind of sentence structure you use in exposition, and it's totally fine there. But when you use it in dialogue, it feels stilted and robotic, at least to me. Here's another example, right? Dalinar talking to Navani. Dalinar shook his head. Yasna puts ideas in my head, like cremlings wintering in the heart of a plant, eating it from the inside until the weather turns. The world didn't decide upon this contest. So, okay, like, is Dalinar some kind of poet all of a sudden that he can just come up with a metaphor right on the spot? Like cremlings wintering in the heart of a plant, eating it from the inside until the weather turns. Does anyone talk like that? Like, have you ever talked to someone and they just come up with a random metaphor about lobsters on the spot like that? Like, it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel natural at all. And like I said, when you multiply, like you could say I'm just cherry picking passages here, but this is the way Sanderson is writing his dialogue. I don't think there's been enough thought given to just natural speech and just the voice of characters, right? Like, it comes across as very scientific. He writes his dialogue in the same way he writes a lot of his exposition, which is already clunky and scientific, but then the characters just don't feel natural. They feel robotic. And that's what I mean by stilted. Now, I mean, the other point I had here was with the juvenile dialogue, and I don't even feel like I have to show any examples of that because, like, everyone has read Lift chapters or even some of the Nightblood dialogues. It was like, it's a bit cringy, right? So, that's whatever. But it's this stilted robotic stuff which has really got me by the end of the book. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Sanderson's perspective control. These books are very much written in third person limited, so like the idea is that you are in the character's head, and a lot of the time, like, the prose and the exposition is done with that particular perspective, right? Like, the way the words are structured and the observations that you see in the descriptions, those are reflective of the character that's seeing them, and it's like a very close narrative style. Like, the master of this style is Joe Abercrombie. If you read any of Abercrombie's books, you know exactly what I mean. Like, a Logan chapter is very differently written than a Glockta chapter or whatever. So Sanderson does this as well, but I feel like his perspective control is just crooked. Like, it's not always there. So I thought that one really obvious example was any of the Lift chapters, where, like, look at this passage here. Like, he's using exposition and prose specific to Lift, right, which is what gives it that sense of voice. Nobody had seen him since the attack on the tower, though, probably off sleeping somewhere. He was smart, that one. Always seemed to know when someone was going to make him do something, so he got out of there quick, right? That's not dialogue. That's just exposition. So by using that in like the narrative, he's giving it that sense of voice, that this is Lift's voice. Okay, fine. But then the problem is, why do you then, in the same chapter, put in stuff like this? Gav wilted like a plant with no water. He slumped back down at the table, drawing a long grey streamer of a gloom spread and bearing the kind of expression no secret handshake could fix. You can come in the light with us, etc. Eager, the boy hopped down and rushed over. The nursemaid joined him. She'd been helping herself to snacks, falsely assuming she could trust Gab with a radiant. Okay, falsely assuming, bearing the kind of expression, like, does that sound like Lift's voice to you? Not to me, right? So this is like one of the things with Sanderson's writing is I feel like he gets into the perspective, he gives you that impression that, okay, yeah, we're in that kind of writing. This is not omniscient, right? This is third person limited. But then he'll throw in stuff like this, kind of expression, falsely assuming. Those are not Lift words. Like Lift, like surely everything you've told me about Lift tells me that she doesn't think like that. So why is that there? And it's the kind of thing where, like, you know, that's just his natural writing style, and it should have been edited out. At least that's my perspective. All right. And then this is another thing where a lot of people have talked about the sheer number of modernisms in this book, just modern words that are showing up in Roshar and kind of taking you out of the story. So like there were a lot of these, right? Like genetics, was that a thing in Stormlight? I don't remember it from the past books, but every time it happened I was like, genetics, isn't that like modern day science? Just a sec, right? Like time is one of those interesting things where, like, when we're writing fantasy stories, you have to be careful about time because, you know, like usually fantasy stories are set around the medieval world, and like they had a different perspective of time. Like they didn't think in seconds and minutes. So if you're using an alternate universe, okay, you have some leeway there, but at the same time, just a sec, that's very modern speech, isn't it? On another level, like that's like Zoomer talk, isn't it? We never dated. I don't know about dated. Like, you know, could be other words. Like here's one which stood out to me. You gang up on me, Zeth shouted to those below. Like, first of all, that doesn't even sound like Zeth. Why would Zeth be talking about ganging up? And secondly, like, gang up sounds kind of modern, but wouldn't it just have been better to just remove that? Like, why is that there? You gang up on me, Zeth shouted to those below. Why didn't Zeth just say 2-on-1, have you no shame? Isn't that more powerful? Like, remove this line, get rid of it. It would be so much better. Why do you have that, right? And then goobering. Yeah, surely all of you guys who read this must have been like goobering, really. And the funny thing is, Sanderson even said like that word doesn't make sense in the book, because whatever, Sigzil pointed out. Back in 15, you know, another example of this. So lots of modernisms throughout the book. Each time it happened, it took me out of the story. These things are tricky to catch, like when you're writing a book. Even if it's an alternate universe, it's very easy for them to sneak in. But again, for a book, like if this was, you know, most authors, I probably wouldn't care as much. But for a book this long, which had this many resources behind it, where you had hundreds of people reading this before it went out, I think that these should have been caught. I don't think we should have had as many as we did. Okay, moving on. You know, there were some points in this book which felt kind of preachy. I don't actually care about this that much, but there were, you know, the points where I was like, okay, I'm going to roll my eyes at this because, yeah, I know Sando, right? Like, those who offer blanket condemnation are fools, for each situation deserves its own consideration, and rarely can you simply apply a saying to a situation without serious weighing of the context. Wow, yeah, that is so enlightening. Thanks, Sando. I really appreciate that. You know, and then like here, when Kaladin lectured some random librarian, this attitude you put on, you don't think it makes you appear strong, but it doesn't. Instead, it makes it very clear that something is wrong with you. Look at Syl's effort. Again, we're talking about stilted dialogue, right? That's what we're getting here. Who berates a person for bettering themselves? Who sells books and stationery yet feels the need to undercut someone, overcoming enormous physical limitations to use them? People don't talk like that. Like, it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel real. And secondly, like, why do we need this? This is not like a main character or an antagonist he's berating. This is just a random librarian. It almost feels like Sanderson is trying to make a point to me, like kind of preachy in that sense. I don't care that much, but it's like, why is that there? Okay, you know, there's a lot of repetitive patterns in this book. Like if you open it up and, like, I swear, go through all the scenes, and the vast majority of scenes start out the same way, which is they start out with the name of the character's POV and the action that they're doing, right? So this is just like a bunch of random scenes I gathered. Almost every scene starts out this way. Dalinar looked out a window. Kaladin soared up through the... Shallan crashed into the bead ocean. Kaladin followed Syl into a section. Abadai the Fused loomed over Shallan. Shallan heaved a sigh of relief. Every single scene starts off the same way. I mean, okay, there's a few that are different, that's fine. But like, there's more variety than that, right? You don't have to start your scenes by like throwing out the character name and what they're doing. That's a good way to start a scene for sure, right? It's a good way to instantly engage the reader and like inform them a lot about, okay, this is the perspective we're following, etc., etc. But like doing it over and over and over just kind of ends up being repetitive, right? It ends up feeling formulaic. And these are the kind of things which line editors would catch, right? Like if a line editor is going through this, be like, oh, this scene started the same way as the last scene, started the same way as the last scene, etc., 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 to the beginning of this giant book. Okay, a few thoughts on forced inclusivity. So one of the things which I noticed there's a lot of discourse around in this book is just the sheer amount of diversity in Rochard, and sometimes it feels like Sanderson is almost being political by including LGBT people, including trans people, all that stuff. Personally, I'm all for it. I want to see more diversity in books, right? So right off the bat, I have to say Renard and Relaine, they were cute. I liked it. I liked the whole thing that they had going on. I was all for it. Diversity is awesome to see in books. However, I think in this book, it doesn't always feel organic. Sometimes it feels like we're going out of our way to point it out. And that, I think, detracts. So I think the message is more powerful when the diversity is just a natural part of the world, right? Like we don't have to have this conversation where the characters are like, oh, why is it this way? Actually, this is the way it should be, or whatever. It comes across as kind of preachy. It comes across as, like every time you bring in these issues of the real world where into Rochard, it just feels like it breaks immersion. But I think that the narrative is more powerful if you just organically make it a part of the world. Like in this world, some people are just gay and that's fine, right? Like we just accept it. But it felt like in this book, he went out of his way to include everyone and to point it out as well. If you always have to point this out, it's bringing us back to the real world. It's breaking immersion. Okay, the loss of mystery. So this is kind of my own little concept. Mystery is a powerful tool in storytelling, right? So now we're going to get a bit more into the plot side of things. But giving it up has consequences, right? And so you have to strike a balance. In this book, Wind and Truth, we had a lot of questions answered, right? So when that happens, like it's exciting, of course, it's always cool to get answers, but you have to understand that sometimes the interesting thing was the mystery. And no matter what answer you give, it won't be as compelling as the mystery had been. So I think that's where you have to strike a balance. Like we got the history of Rochard in this book. And for me, I don't know if this is necessarily a case, but was it too fleshed out? Like personally, I became a bit less interested as it went. Like once we started seeing more of Tanavast's perspective and more of the history, like it just kind of was like, okay, yeah, I guess whatever. I guess that's what happened, right? But it was like in the previous books, it was always such a big like, whoa, what's going on there? What happened all those years ago? Once you actually see it, it's less powerful, right? So I think I'm not sure if you perfectly struck the balance from a plot perspective. You might have different perspectives on that. That's totally fine. This is not like a huge deal. And then there were some characters who lost their power to me. So one great example is Zeth. And this might be very controversial. Zeth's flashback sequences didn't really work for me. Like I honestly didn't care much. Right? I thought that Zeth was such a cool and compelling character. And one of the reasons for that is because, right off the bat, you don't know anything about him. He's like this enigmatic figure who's running around assassinating people. And it's like, what's going on with him? Right? And it's almost one of those situations where he was so cool because of his enigma that no matter what story you gave him, it would just be a disappointment, at least for me. Another example, Taravangium is odium. What we did not need is Taravangian POVs with as much introspection as we got. We can have antagonist POVs, and that's great. But when you have the antagonist POV and you're just continuing with that same overdone introspection as you have with every other character, it kills the mystery of that character, right? So I still loved the way it ended with Taravangium. I like all of that. But I feel like that tension could have been better drawn out if we didn't have those interludes with Taravangium, or if we did, then make it more of a mystery, right? Like, don't tell us why he's doing that. Don't tell us how he's feeling. Just make him do it, right? Like, make him do that thing, evil thing. Make him recruit that whatever herald, right? And then we're left wondering, why is he doing this? Oh God, what's the threat? No, instead, he's just going to tell us, Taravangium feels this way and he's doing this because of that. It's not, it's not as compelling for me, at least. And then Yasna as well, right? Like Yasna, similar to Zeth, I feel like she lost a bit of compellingness in the story. having too many POVs from a perspective where again we're going through all the introspection, it kills that illusion of just this crazy badass scholar, right? It was still kind of an interesting character arc, but I don't know. Lots of mystery is something interesting, right? This is this concept, like this is something Joe Abercrombie has talked about a lot with his books. Is people tell him like, oh, you should give us this character's POV, and he says, no, actually you don't want that, because if I gave it to you, it won't be interesting anymore. And I think that's very true. I think Sanderson has gone a bit too far out of his way to tell us exactly how every character is feeling, and ultimately I think it just detracts from the whole story. Okay, some very specific plot/character thoughts. Again, I don't think any of these were that big a deal. Like we're going down in magnitude as we go through this list, right? Like it really was about the subtext and the prose for me. But there were some specific thoughts I had. So personally, I think therapist Kaladin is just boring. I don't know. Like I guess this was kind of like the natural conclusion to his arc, sure. But over a series this long, I think it could have been more. I think that we could have gone in different directions. We could have grown in different ways. I found Kaladin's entire storyline here to just be boring. Like I just was not compelled by it whatsoever. Zet's backstory felt underwhelming. So I mentioned this before. For that same reason, like you have this badass assassin cool guy, and then you just turn his backstory into family drama, which is fine. Like it's fair. It's okay, but you lose that sense of mystery. Shallan's entire plotline felt contrived and dumb. So I'll stand by this one. Like, who even cares about Reyes? Like, what was all that? Like, all it felt like was Shallan was being set up for book 6, and whatever future Cosmere stuff is gonna happen. I guess that's okay, but like, what did I read these 5 books for? She's a main POV. I don't understand the point, right? Like, to me, both Kaladin and Shallan, like their plot lines were just complete tankers, which is disappointing, right? Because they were kind of like the main characters of this story. Anyway, Phelan City, everything that happened there, that was okay. I wasn't that compelled by it. Adolin's plotline I loved. I thought that was spectacular, and there was a lot there. I loved the metaphors with towers and all of that. I loved him learning to fight like an ordinary soldier. It was really good. I liked the little thing at the end where they went back and rescued the castle, and Maya's Shardblades coming back. I did think like Maya seemed very normal, a bit too fast. Like, was that just me? She seemed like she was totally fine when just in Rhythm of War she could like barely speak one sentence. So it felt like that was maybe a bit too fast, but whatever, it's fine. Maya and Adoline, cool combo. I liked it. Dalinar, perfect ending. Like I love the way his story concluded. Like it just makes me want to like pick up the next book just to know what happens, right? Yeah, I thought that him learning to let someone else like he doesn't have to be the one that solves every problem is just a great conclusion to his particular character arc. Giving up the power of honor, it's a powerful thing. Dalinar, favorite character. Venli, like who cares about Venli, guys? Honestly, like Rhythm of War, one of the reasons it was like subpar was because of Venli's flashbacks. Who gives a crap? Like whatever. I guess it was fine. And then finally the audio narration, guys. I don't like this audio or these narrators. It's not just me. I feel like Kate Redding and Michael Kramer are super popular, but especially Kate Redding, it's like almost unbearable. I like just listening to her monotone drawling on, and then Michael Kramer too. He like emphasizes the naturally robotic nature of Sanderson's prose, and that just makes it worse, right? Like, so I think the narrators did not help here, and maybe this is a controversial opinion. I think there are far better narrators that could have been used for this book, but anyway, that is what it is, and that's the end of my little presentation here. Thank you for coming along. Stormlight is a series about moments. It's about those big climaxes that make you punch your fist and go, yeah! Like we remember You Can't Have My Pain, because it's such a powerful moment. But in remembering that, it's easy to forget what a slog the first half of Oathbringer was. We remember Honor is Dead, and that's just such a powerful moment. And then we kind of just dismiss Edgedancer, right? So if you're looking at this book holistically, we really have to evaluate the whole thing. And for me personally, it was kind of like it was just disappointing, right? It felt like this book was under-edited, and that's essentially what I go back to, like over and over again. I just keep thinking to myself that the potential wasn't reached. You know, like if he had just taken a bit more time, if he had his line editors go through this a bit more carefully instead of rushing to get it out so fast, then this truly could have been that much better, right? And it just makes me a little bit sad because this is like an author's life's work, like, and it's not going to be the masterpiece that it should be, right? Like this is a story that's worthy of better writing. It's a story that's worthy of just really powerful, like, wordplay, like craft. But ultimately it's coming out as just popcorn fiction. And I don't know, maybe that's just me who finds that kind of sad, but it is what it is, right? And that's the direction the author has taken, and he understands that most of his audience just doesn't care about these things as much as I do. But the end result is that I just don't think the Stormlight Archive will ever be in the same ranking as something like Lord of the Rings, right? Or even A Song of Ice and Fire, because just the craft isn't there. And it's not that it can't be. Like, I have to emphasize this. I really think Sanderson is a talented author. I just, the thing about writing is that good prose and craft, that happens in editing. So you have to spend a lot of time just looking at every single line, looking at every single word, seeing how they flow together, the rhythm of the story, the rhythm of the paragraphs from word to word to word. And ultimately, I just don't think that's something he's got time for, right? Like, he just wants to get these books out as fast as possible. And a lot of people want that, but for me personally, it's just not something I'm interested in. I hope that this video gave you a slightly different perspective. I hope that that you understand how much respect I have for the man and the story, and I hope that you can keep on reading and keep on finding amazing books, and that you have an amazing holiday season. Thank you.